This morning we're carrying on the series in Galatians. We'll be looking at chapter 4 from verse 1 to 7. So if you do turn there now. It's worth reminding us of the context of this passage. So Galatians was written as a letter by Paul with the primary intention of encouraging the Galatian church that to be a true believer of Jesus didn't require circumcision. And as such, this passage we'll be looking at today, Paul essentially reiterates the gospel to the Galatian church in order to remind them about how the work of Christ means that the law, and especially circumcision, no longer has any power or necessity over their lives. So we'll start reading from verse 1, where it says, "What I am saying is that as long as an heir is under age, he is no different from a slave. Although he owns the whole estate, the heir is subject to guardians and trustees until the time set by his father. So also, when we were underage, we were in slavery under the elemental spiritual forces of the world. But when the set time had fully come, God sent his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those under the law, that we might receive adoption to sonship. Because you are his sons, God sent the Spirit of his Son into our hearts, the Spirit who cries out, 'Abba, Father.' So you are no longer a slave, but God's child. And since you are his child, God has made you also an heir." This passage that Paul gives is primarily concerned about the relationship between slavery under the law and freedom that comes under Christ. And when we look at the world, we see that in ourselves, this relationship between our slavery under laws and freedom under Christ defines so much of who we are. It is a basic human instinct to want to rebel against laws that are given to you. 2 years ago, I was backpacking around Europe, and I was in Rome with my brother and a friend, and the hostel in Rome told us we couldn't use their kitchen. And we were quite annoyed about this, because eating out is fairly expensive, especially in Rome. So my friend came up with an ingenious idea. He thought, well, if we strap bin bags around the entire kitchen, and in Rome they sell these watermelons that are about 25 kg big. We can buy one of these watermelons, cut it up. Because we'll have strapped bin bags, we won't technically have used the kitchen. We can gorge ourselves on watermelon, have a feast, and we'll have, followed the rules. It's safe to say when the hostel manager came back, he wasn't very happy with us. Because he considered that not only had we broken this rule to not use the kitchen, he didn't really buy our whole bin bag thing, but we'd also knowingly done so. And so because he'd given us this rule, we stand not just condemned for breaking it, but we stand twice condemned because we had knowingly broken the rule. And in Galatians, that is Paul's primary concern about the law. He doesn't think that the law is bad. He recognizes that the law was given by Moses from God. But he recognizes that without Christ, the law is insufficient. And in fact, because none of us can achieve the perfection of the law by ourselves, when we follow the law alone, we not only fall and become imperfect because we've broken the law, but we stand twice condemned because we have ended up knowingly broken the law. And so in this passage, Paul is talking to the Galatians about the effects of the law. And he compares the law to a guardian who oversees the estate of a child who is underage. And just as the guardian, just as a child who is underage, technically owns the entirety of the estate of their father, so also through the law, we can technically own the perfection of God. We can technically have access to God. by perfectly following the law, we could become perfect. And in becoming perfect, be able to commune with God, who is a perfect being. But what Paul does with this analogy is he says that just as the heir, while technically having the full access of their father's estate, in practicality is no better off than a slave. Because in practicality, they do not own a single thing. And so he compares it to the law by saying that yes, well, through the law, we can technically have perfect access to God. In practicality, because none of us by our own merit can follow the entirety of the law. In practicality, without Christ, none of us, we're no better than slaves. None of us can have perfect communion with God. And that is the first point today. That without Christ, we are slaves, as Paul says. Slaves to the law and slaves to the world. But then the next question is, if we're slaves, what exactly are we slaves to? And Paul answers this question with a line that almost sounds like it comes from an Avengers film, by saying we were in slavery under the elemental spiritual forces of the world. And you've got to wonder, what on earth does that mean? It sounds like we were in slavery to an infinity stone from the Avengers or something. But what Paul is linking to probably isn't that far off that, actually. Because in a Greek understanding of the ancient world, the elemental spiritual forces normally referred to elements such as earth, wind, and fire that were considered to have divine properties, and which many of the Galatian church before becoming Christians would have believed controlled their destiny, controlled their life, controlled the way the world works. And actually we know this not just from Greek writings around that time, but we also know it from Jewish writings. There's a book called The Wisdom of Solomon that many early Jews considered scripture. And in that, it actually has this passage where it talks about those who don't follow God. And it said, "Nor did they recognize the artisan while paying heed to his works. But they supposed that either fire or wind or swift air, or the circle of stars or turbulent water, or the luminaries of heaven were the gods that rule the world." Paul is reminding his readers that before Christ, they considered themselves to be under slavery, not just to the law, but to these things that they considered to have divine power over them. But what is really audacious of Paul is his link he makes between the law and these elemental spiritual forces. Because if you're a good Jew, you know that to worship one of these elemental spiritual forces is utter idolatry. Nothing else. It's a symbol of your separation from God. After all, when you read the Old Testament story, you see that the key reason for their exile from the promised land of Israel was because they had been idolatrous to foreign gods, such as these divine properties. And yet, the language Paul uses between verse 2 and verse 3 of this passage is remarkable. Because he starts by comparing us as underage minors and the law as a guardian. But then in verse 3 he moves on and he compares us being underage minors to being in slavery to these divine elements. His insinuation is that the law itself is no better than any one of these other divine elements. It's a remarkable move to say that not only is the law insufficient, but in itself it is no better than the very gods you consider to be idolatrous. And so here at the beginning of this passage, Paul could not be stressing in clearer terms that before Christ, each and every one of us was a slave. We lacked the freedom to commune in fullness with God. And before we move on to the rest of the passage, I want us just to dwell on this for a moment. Because a lot of us as Christians, we become very complacent in the fact that we enjoy having this freedom with God. And we forget the slavery from which we have been rescued. And to illustrate this point, I actually want to show a clip from a film called Mockingjay that it'll seem quite random. I'll explain it in the end, but if we just show the clip. I show that clip because today, all around the world, similar scenes like that are actually occurring. And it's easier to show a fictional clip than a real life clip. And one of the things that you see around the world is that when people are denied their freedom, there is almost nothing they will do to try and obtain it. If you look even this week, you can see hundreds killed in Sudan seeking to obtain freedom. Even today, hundreds will die in Syria fighting for their freedom. This morning, thousands were marching in Hong Kong demanding political freedom. And they're doing that not for divine freedom, not for the greatest freedom of all, but just for political freedom. And if people will do that just to have political freedom, how much more remarkable is it that we have been freed from the ultimate form of slavery through Christ? It is a reminder of just how remarkable what God has done is for us, and how remarkable the slavery that we have been set free from is. And so as we carry on in this passage, Paul continues to tell us that although we were slaves before Christ, in Christ we are free. And he does this by telling us about the work that has been done through Jesus. He begins by telling us that Jesus came born of a woman. This links back right to the beginning of the biblical narrative, to Genesis 3:15, from the very moment that humanity first became captive, the very moment humanity first rebelled against God, when God promised that a descendant would come of Eve's, who would crush the work of sin and slavery. Paul is bringing the story to completion. He's reminding his readers that that promise that they have been looking forward to from the very beginning of time has now been brought to completion through Christ. He also says that Christ came under the law. He's reminding his readers that Christ fulfilled every requirement of the law because we could not. He fulfilled the perfect life in order that when God looks at us, he would see not our unrighteousness, but God's perfection. And so we could commune in perfection with God himself. And then he reminds his readers that because of this work of Jesus, we have received adoption to sonship. It's a remarkable promise. And the language of adoption, there's really two things it's getting at. The first is it refers back to the adoption of Israel that you see in the Exodus narratives, where God steps in and saves his people, where he redeems them from the land of slavery and makes them his own treasured possession. The second thing Paul is referring to, though, is a Roman idea of adoption, in which a slave master would adopt their slave, not just bringing them out of slavery, but conferring onto them the full rights of a son, giving them a share in the master's own inheritance. And this is truly remarkable, because so often when we talk about the work of Jesus, we focus on his work to redeem us from slavery. But not only, it's a nice little announcement, not only has he redeemed us from slavery, but he has also conferred upon us all the rights of a son. And so we come before God not just as one who has redeemed us, but as one who has brought us into his own family. One who has given us every honor that is imaginable by making us his own child. It's not just that we've been saved from being on death row. It's as though we've been saved from being on death row and then given every honor, given the Nobel Prize as well. It's a remarkable and truly outrageous turn of events that we have access to. A few weeks ago, I was in Sweden with a mission trip from London School of Theology that thankfully some of you were able to help support, pray for and fund. But one of the remarkable things when we were in Sweden was there is a day we were doing street evangelism. And I met a man called Ezra who was on the street. And Ezra had come from Eritrea. He'd escaped this country where he didn't have freedom, crossed the Sahara, got a boat across the Mediterranean, and escaped to Sweden, which he was saying was a free country. He was glad to be in Sweden. But as I was speaking to him, what was remarkable was he was telling me that although he was now in a free country, his heart was still not free. He still could not escape the pains that existed in his heart. He still felt under bondage to the things of this world. I was able to tell Ezra about this message that day. And Ezra accepted Jesus into his life. And in that moment, Ezra had told me that if nothing had happened in his life then, he did not see his life carrying on for much longer. You see, Ezra had crossed so much of the world to try and find freedom. But the freedom that Ezra truly needed was found through the work of Christ. Through the work that he was able to accept that day by becoming adopted as Christ, as a son of God. And that is also the very thing we have access to. The freedom we have won to us through the work of Christ. And finally, as we conclude by looking at this passage, Paul goes on to tell us how we can be assured of the freedom that we have. And he tells us that we can be assured of the freedom we have because the Spirit confirms this freedom to us. He says that God sent the Spirit of his Son into our hearts, and the Spirit cries out, Abba, Father. I love that word Abba because it's not actually Greek, it's Aramaic. And Paul uses it here most likely because it was used by Jesus himself in his own prayer language, as we know from the Gospels. But it's a word that refers to the intimacy between a child and their father. It's a word that is distinctly different from pater, the other word used in Greek, that would be used far more formally. But I also love the fact he says the Spirit calls out. He doesn't say the Spirit says. The word in Greek is kradzo. It literally refers to a loud cry. Again, referring to the intimacy that because of the Spirit's work in us, we can have with the Father. A reminder that because the Spirit now dwells within us, that we don't need to be rigid in our prayer life before God. We don't need to be formulaic. We can be open and free, just as a child would be to a good father. The other thing Paul says about the Spirit here is he calls the Spirit of the Son. He's reminding the audience that the Spirit's work connects us to Jesus. who is seated at the right hand of the Father, interceding for us before the Father himself. It is a reminder that the primary work of the Spirit is to increase in us our faith, and in doing so to connect us with God himself through Jesus. And it is this work of the Spirit that is universal across the church. In 1 Corinthians 12:3, Paul states that no one can even say Jesus Christ is Lord without the Spirit. And often, as charismatics, when we read Spirit, we think of the Spirit of power. We think of that work of the Spirit. But here Paul is referring to the work of the Spirit to connect us to Jesus, that occurs to all Christians. And I'm grateful for the story Matt shared earlier, actually, because one important thing to remember is that even if we were to never experience the manifestation of the Spirit, this work of the Spirit that connects us to Jesus is the most important part of our relationship with the Spirit. It is the bit of the Spirit's work that is so essential. And actually, if we were never even to receive any of the manifestation, this is what is sufficient. However, we are charismatics. And that means that even though that is all that is necessary, we do pursue more of the Spirit than just that. And I'll step slightly outside the text here, because I think it's important. But throughout Paul, he reminds his readers that not only is it important that they have the Spirit, but that they pursue the manifestation of it. Just 4 verses later, after he says that anyone who says Jesus is Lord has the Spirit within them, he also says that the manifestation of it is given for the common good. And it is this manifestation that, when our faith is weak, can remind us of the truth of the gospel message. Can remind us of just how much that God has done for us. And I want to finish by just sharing on this a bit of my own story. Because I grew up in a very non-charismatic church. And I'm very grateful for the upbringing I had for the first 10 years of my life. It connected me to Jesus, and that is the most important thing that any of us could ever receive. And I know because of that, I have certainty that the Spirit was working in me, as Paul says in this passage, to give assurance of the faith I had. To connect me to the ongoing work of Jesus in heaven. But when I moved to England at the age of 10, I moved to a very charismatic church, and I was able to experience the manifestation of God. And it gave me a confidence in the faith that I did not have previously. By seeing people operate in the gifts of the Spirit, I was able to be blessed in ways that I had not been previously. And so as we look at the Spirit's work within us, let us remember that the Spirit's work within us to connect us with Jesus is that which is of primary importance. If nothing else comes, that is sufficient. But yet, while holding that truth, let us be people who pursue all that the Spirit has, in order that we can access the fullness of God. And so as we sum up today, let us remember what God has done for us, the incredible work brought to completion through Jesus. That before Jesus came, we were. But because of the work that Jesus has done, we have freedom. Freedom to be God's children. Freedom to access the fullness of God. And because of that, God has sent His Spirit within us, so that we would know the truth of that message. I'm just going to finish by praying, but I want to leave two responses as we finish today. Firstly, I want to give us room for Matt Burry's word about the love of the Father. Today we've talked about the Father coming to give us adoption into his family. And part of that is, as Matt shared, that we receive that love of God. And so if anyone wants to receive that love afresh, please do come forward at the end for prayer. The second call I want to make is for anyone who feels like they've forgotten the freedom that Christ has called us to. Anyone who feels that this faith that they have become a part of, or yes, maybe they started with the freedom and the sonship of God, has become monotonous. They've lost sight of what it was all about. And so if that is you, please do not leave this morning without making room for God to meet with you afresh. The ministry team will be here at the end. Please come forward and allow God to encounter you again. I'll finish by praying.